Hello and welcome to the Art of Being Human. Today I want to go into the various stages of grief. And remember, if you do remember from the last segment, I said that the stages of grief are going to be the same, whether you have been recently diagnosed with something and then you are going to possibly not make it through because of that, say cancer or heart trouble or whatever it is, you go through the same stages of grieving because of the fact that you have this illness that you may not recover from, or whether you're going through grief because a loved one of yours has just passed away, or whether you're going through grief because you've lost somebody due to a move or a change in job situation. There are any kind of losses that you go through that are important to you that you grieve. The stages of that grief are going to be the same. And a little different quality about the grief. For example, divorce gives grief, but sometimes a divorce is actually less difficult than if a person moves away. If you get a divorce, let's say, and your spouse is still living in the area, or your ex-spouse is living in the area, and you see them once in a while, this keeps on rekindling that grief all over again. And if the person has died, and so there's no chance of you ever seeing them again on this earth, well, then that makes the closure better than if there's a chance that you're going to see them over and over and over again, even though technically you're not connected with them anymore because you've got a divorce. So sometimes the death of a spouse is easier to handle than the divorce of a spouse, where there's a chance that you're going to be seeing them. And if you have children, you're definitely going to be seeing them, especially if they're young, because you've got to have them visiting both parents, so you've got to work together with that. So there are certain situations where these stages are easier to handle than others, just by virtue of the fact that the separation may be permanent, but the person may still be alive. Or if there's a move where you won't see anybody again maybe for years and years, or you don't expect to, that can be pretty much like a permanent change, and the grief is handled almost like the person died. So anyway, I want to go into the stages of grief. I'm going to list them all first, and there's only 4 of them, and then I'm going to go into each one. The first would be denial, the second would be anger, the third would be depression, and the fourth would be acceptance, when you finally accept the fact that the separation is there, the death is permanent, and so forth and so on. So let's go into the denial. Whenever you get into a state of denial, say you're going to get a divorce and your grief is due to that, there's always a feeling of numbness and a feeling of shock, and this can't be, and I know that this isn't true, this can't be true, and you start to think of ways that it's not true. If you have a friend of yours that's been diagnosed with a very bad illness, and you're thinking, well, you know, people do survive, people do get treatment, this isn't going to be permanent, you give yourself reasons why you don't believe it's true, or you try to find reasons why it's possibly not true. One minute you may feel emotional pain, the next minute you may feel nothing, everything is like a dream, you're kind of numbed out. Any kind of a shock, you're in a state of shock. I remember when my father died, I was teaching, and when I found out that he had died, it took me 3 hours just to get things together to go back home. I was like a 4-hour drive away, 4.5, 5-hour drive away. In order just to pick up some clothes and toothbrushes and toothpaste and cups and whatever I was going to take with me, I would sit for long periods of time and kind of stare into space, and then I'd get something else together. Then I'd stare into space and then get something else together. And it just takes a long time for you to even function, because you're kind of like in a shock. This can't be. It is, but it isn't. And you haven't let your mind kind of reset itself to realize that what you're talking about is a permanent situation. So you can have those feelings of shock and numbness and pain, and it just takes a long time. Everything seems like a dream. Now, this actual stage of denial probably doesn't last too long. maybe a few hours or so, and then you gradually wrap your head around the fact that, oh yeah, this has occurred, this is true, this has actually happened, and you know, my loved one is no longer alive. It just seems odd, it doesn't seem right, it doesn't seem like it could possibly be, and you keep looking for them, you keep expecting them to call, you keep expecting them to do the usual things that they do, but they're not doing it, of course, because they're no longer alive. And you have to kind of keep reminding yourself, oh yeah, that's right, they're not here. No, I won't be seeing them. They're not going to be calling me and saying, let's get together and have a cup of coffee or something. They're just not going to do it because they're no longer around. It's particularly difficult if you don't expect the death. If it's an unexpected death, all of these phases become harder to handle because of the fact that you are still on kind of living in that kind of dream world where they're still alive, especially if it's unexpected. It's very, very shocking. Shocking to lose a child, shocking to lose somebody that's young, shocking to lose somebody that's been killed in an accident when they were healthy and they had all kinds of plans and they were good things they were going to do, and suddenly they're no longer alive. It's very difficult to handle that. Grief is in itself a special mode of existence that we go through when at a severe loss, especially if it's an unexpected loss. Now, sometimes the loss is expected. Sometimes the person has been suffering from an illness for a long time and they've gone downhill, and you know that they're not going to make it. Does it make it easier? It makes it, I think, a little easier in the sense that the inevitable that you knew about has finally occurred, but it doesn't take it away. There's still going to be some shock. There's still going to be some denial. Even if you expected death, it's still a shock to hear that it's actually happened. So it just makes it very difficult. Now, the anger that comes next can be caused by fear. Part of the fear is that you can't make it on your own. You are a wife, you've just lost your husband. He controlled the finances, he did the grocery shopping, he wrote out the checks. You know, now that may not be true in many marriages, but it still is true in some. And the thing is, if you don't do, if you can't manage, or if you haven't managed your household or whatever situation you're in, but someone else has kind of taken the lead role, a lot of times with your being happy that it's happened that way, suddenly you have to take over and do all of the things that they have done because they're no longer around to do it. And this is a frightening thing. So there's a fear that you can't make it on your own. There's anger as well. It's not unusual for a person who is bereaved to be angry. What are they angry at? They can be angry at the person for dying. And then they can feel guilty because they're angry at the person who's dying. Do not judge yourself if you're going through something like that. It's a very normal reaction in grief. People who are bereaved, people who are in grief, oftentimes are angry at the person who died. Why did you leave me? Why did this happen? And they know it's irrational when they do it, but they can't stop doing it. And so this is a natural part of the grieving process, and you should not judge yourself or feel guilty for it. It will phase down, like the grief is supposed to do. It will phase down, and so it's not going to be there forever. You cannot expect yourself to be rational when you are going through the grief process. Rationality just goes out the window. Don't expect it. So if you're thinking unusual things, unless you're a danger to yourself or somebody else, just consider it to be a normal part of the grief reaction that will phase down, because normally it will. Now, if you're in a complicated grief because you can't for some reason get closure, then of course you may need to have some professional help with it, because otherwise it's going to be with you for a long time. But on a temporary basis, you're going to have lots of emotions that you didn't realize that you had, and lots of anger and lots of being upset. And if you've had a kind of half and half relationship with your spouse, let's say you're angry, you've had trouble in your marriage, it's going to be harder to lose a person that you have a difficult relationship with than it is to lose somebody that you've had a good relationship with. You might not think that's possible, but it's traumatic. And what comes back to you is all the difficult times, and why couldn't you get it resolved, and why couldn't it work out, and why couldn't things have been better, and it's my fault, I should have done this, I should have done that. There's lots of recriminations, there's lots of anger at yourself, and just kind of let that go, because that's also a part of the grieving process. So you can have an anger at God who took the person away, you can have an anger at the person who deserted you, you can feel guilty because you couldn't stop the death, you can feel guilty because of past thoughts and actions that you did or had that you felt weren't the best. You can feel guilty about that. And another thing you can feel guilty about, you might have secretly a sense of relief that the person is gone. No more pain for them, no more sitting at the hospital for hours at a time for you, and you may have a sense of relief that the person is gone, and then you can feel guilty that you feel relieved that they're gone. But I don't want you to feel guilty at all. It's a normal reaction that you would feel guilty because you're relieved. But that's just something that happens, and it happens in the grief process. And as long as you understand that anything that you're feeling is probably a part of your grief reaction, because we all grieve in different kinds of ways. So as long as you understand that this is just normal for this period of time, it will not last, it should not last. If it does last, you need to get help with it so that it won't continue, and then you can it'll just pass off with time. Grief, fortunately, is something that within a few days you start to automatically feel better. You start to get used to the fact that the person is no longer there, or the divorce is completed, or the move is completed, or the person has finally passed on. It doesn't mean you miss them any less, but you're not constantly thinking about that person. You have other things to do. You still have to maintain a household. You still have to go back to a job. You know, there's all kinds of normal things that fortunately will start to interrupt that grief process. So it doesn't have to be forever and ever and ever. The people who get stuck in it, they struggle with it for a long period of time, sometimes for years, but they shouldn't have to do that. Grief is very intense when it happens, and then it should phase off. Within, I think, 3 or 4 days, you're going to start thinking about life again, and the things you need to do, and the places you need to be. And that would be a normal thing to happen. And then you start to feel better and better and better. So you can feel relief that the person is gone, especially after a long illness. And or some kind of anything that's abusive relationship. You can feel freer if there's an abusive relationship and finally the person is gone. You know, but there are mixed feelings. Why didn't it work out? I love that person and it didn't work out. Why? That person was abusive. Why didn't I leave that person? Why did I stay? Why did I feel I had to stay and put up with it? Now they're gone, and I'm happy that they're gone in a way because I won't be abused by them anymore. Oh, I feel so guilty because if I love them, I should not want them gone, and yet at the same time I'm feeling happiness or some kind of a relief, maybe not happiness, but some kind of a relief that they're gone. That's all right. All of that stuff, as mixed up as it gets, is part of the grief process. And if you feel that way, just acknowledge it as being part of the grief process. You know, my mother used to say to me, and she was right, when I was a lot younger, I mean, I'm in my 80s now, so that was many moons ago. If you have intense emotions, just acknowledge them. It is what it is. And once those feelings have been acknowledged, they are a lot less intense than if you fight them. If you have, like, say, nervousness or anxiety or fear, what you tend to want to do is to fight it. I'm not going to feel fear anymore. I'm just not going to do it. I'm going to be fine. I'm not going to be nervous anymore. And what happens is it gets worse when you fight it. It gets worse when you fight it because your body wants to have you acknowledge what's going on. Once you say, yeah, I am nervous, but that's all right. I'll get over it. It's not going to be like this forever. So you give yourself some encouragement, but you acknowledge what you're feeling. The body does not have to fight to be acknowledged. It has been acknowledged, and it will help to reduce the intensity of the emotions that you're suffering from. Now, this is true also in a situation that's not related to grief. I read a book once by a pastor. I don't even remember his name. And he had a lot of anxiety about something. I don't even remember the situation. But the way he handled it was like the tension built up and he was getting anxious. And he let it crash over him like a wave. And he visualized this wave of anxiety crashing over him. And then it relieved itself. And then it went back out to sea and he felt better. But he didn't fight it. He let it come, and when he acknowledged it, here it is, I'm very anxious. It took a natural turn and left him a lot better. Eventually he got over his anxiety, and I believe probably he had some treatment as well. I certainly hope so. But the relief part was the fact he's not fighting what his body is telling him. He's acknowledging what his body is telling him. And when he acknowledges it, it doesn't have to fight to be acknowledged. And as a result of that, the intensity of the emotions gets less. You know, if a child is crying and doesn't feel like you're giving him any attention, what does he do? He cries harder and harder and harder. But if you go up to him and you say, I understand you're crying and I know you're upset and I'm right here, he has a connection with you. He doesn't have to cry harder and harder to get your attention. He's got your attention. So therefore, he can feel a certain amount of relief and the crying can stop or be greatly reduced. So it is true. An acknowledgement of the emotions will help to reduce those emotions. If you don't have that acknowledgement of emotions, then the emotions get stronger and an attempt of the body to be recognized or the attempt of the person to be recognized. And when you recognize it, then they don't feel so much intensity because they know that it's going to be taken care of. Now, I know I'm spending some time here, but I've worked with a lot of people who are very, very anxious. And there are ways of helping them not to feel so anxious. Now, of course, there's all kinds of medications and stuff like that. And sometimes people need these medications and they need these help. But there's nothing better than a human being just staying with you, saying just the right thing at the right time. And that can really reduce tension as well. Okay, to go on from that, the depression phase, it takes over when the person starts to accept the fact of the reality of the death. That's when it starts to take over. And with the depression comes a lot of behaviors: crying, not being able to eat or sleep, staring at the walls, not wanting to talk to other people, kind of withdrawing from life, not enjoying activities that they normally enjoy, and the feelings of loss and helplessness and hopelessness. And when you feel hopeless, there's no change. I can't make a change. I have no hope for the future, that's when feelings of suicide can come into the picture. But most people can go through it and realize that I feel terrible, but if they can be given the encouragement to know that this is a normal process, they will move through it. With the help that they need, they will move through it, and they don't have to go through this forever. This is not going to last forever. This is a temporary situation. Grief is temporary, or should be temporary, unless you get stuck in the grieving process, and then that's another matter. But we're going to assume that you're going through a normal grieving process. It will start to lessen. And as it starts to lessen, you'll start thinking about other things. When you start thinking about other things other than the person that you've lost, or the job that you've lost, or whatever your personal situation is, when you can start thinking about something else except the loss, then you've already started the healing process, because you'll move through it. So that's what you need to understand. There is hope at the end of the tunnel. The other one is acceptance. This is the last stage, and that's when you realize that you can live without the person, without the job. You won't never forget the person, but you can live without them. You can make your way. You can have a life. And you may have a fear of loving somebody again, because if you love somebody again, you may lose them. You know, if you really love people and you want to help people, there's always a chance you're going to lose them. In order to live a normal life with normal emotions, you have to allow yourself to be vulnerable. And when you allow yourself to be vulnerable, sometimes things happen and the relationship doesn't last. And it is sad. But that's the only way that you can have a normal life emotionally. If you are actually trying very hard to steel yourself away from being hurt, and so you just steal yourself away from that, and you don't get involved with other people, and you don't allow yourself to have feelings for other people because you're afraid of being hurt, then you miss all the richness of human relationships that makes life what it is. So it is a risk when you become involved with people that something's going to happen and you're going to lose them. But that's a risk that we all face. And at the same time, you may not lose them. Just because you love a person, just because you like a person and you get involved with them, does not necessarily mean that you're going to lose them. It means that if you've had a lot of losses, you may expect that to happen because you're used to that happening, but it doesn't mean it's going to happen. So you should just enjoy relationships and appreciate life as it is. So you may fear of becoming involved with someone too soon, and sometimes that does happen, so you may need to be a little guarded, but you don't make any major decisions for a few months after a death, because if you do, the decisions may be based upon the grief rather than being based upon reality. So you need to give yourself time to heal and not make major decisions too soon. But also don't keep yourself from human relationships, because that also can be a part of the healing process, the fact that you can deal with people. Well, I'm going to close it here. We're almost out of time. We're going to continue with this next time. Please join me then.